So for those of you that don't know me and I haven't met before, my name is Luliani Amo. I'm the Executive Director for the Tech Diversity Foundation. Today is really an opportunity for us to celebrate the second DEI discovery course, which starts next week as part of the Tech Diversity Foundation. You will get a link after this webinar to join and register the course if that's something you're interested in doing. And the course starts on the 2nd of March. So that's a shameless plug over for Tech Diversity. I'm really excited to introduce my two guests this morning. I'm going to start off by introducing Lindell. So Lindell McCain von Schill, who in addition to being Human Rights Commissioner in Charlottesville, Virginia, is the Director of Diversity, Equity and Inclusion at the, let me get this right, for the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. So thank you very much and welcome, Lindell. And secondly, I'd like to introduce Warren Anderson, who, in addition to being the Group Vice President at Gartner Research, is the primary backer of Brood, a high-performance coaching organization. So welcome, Warren.
Thank you.
Now we'll talk about how astronomy research and high performance coaching all come together in a moment. But the topic today is all about DEI strategy for resilience in challenging times. Now, in my experience over many years, and maybe I'm just being a little bit cynical, but in challenging times, the strategy tends to be around cutting headcount and reducing costs. So I'm really keen to hear both of your perspectives around how DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, can be a strategy for resilience. Now, Lindell, I'm going to start with you, and if you can start by just giving a little bit of an insight around what you do, what the Astronomy Observatory is all around, and how this kind of dovetails into the DE&I conversation.
Okay, sounds great. Kia ora koutou. As Luli said, I'm Lindell. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Diversity and Inclusion at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, which we call NRAO. We are a taxpayer-funded agency supported by the National Science Foundation. We are very heavily research and education focused. And what we do is we collect astronomical data in huge amounts. And to jump right into our diversity, equity, inclusion focus, we really stepped into this realm about 10 years ago and took it very seriously, embedded it deeply in the organization, to the point that last year we changed our mission statement for the first time in 40 years to specifically include the work that we do in broadening participation in DE&I realm. So this is deeply embedded in our organization for a lot of reasons, including social justice, the need for this work, and also recognizing the work that needs to be done in the future. And so I'll leave it at there for now, but that's a little
I was going to say, Linda, that's a great introduction. Thank you. We're going to unpack that a bit more in a moment. So Warren, from your perspective, DEI as a strategy for resilience.
So I think, Luli, the first thing that I would say is DEI is not just a strategy for resilience, it's a strategy for high performance. And whether you're going through good times or bad times, the most successful organizations, no matter whether they're sporting organizations, business organizations, what they do is they play on strengths of individuals and they bring different people together, to form incredible groups with incredible outcomes. And I like to explain that to people. In the early 1900s, the Olympics was filled with what you call the Da Vinci Man, which is, you've probably all seen the picture of the Da Vinci Man standing like that. Arm span is the same as their height. They were 5'9.5", and that was considered the perfect athlete. We know that that's not the case because we know that high jumpers have longer Achilles tendons than people who can't actually jump high. We'll know that the best basketball players in America are not just tall, they've got a longer arm span than they do height. So we've seen diversity in terms of the physiological aspects. What we also started to see in sport is bringing in both those cultural personality differences to create really, high performing teams is where the world has started to improve in high performance.
So to add on to that then, Warren, would you say that diversity then is also lends itself to a competitive advantage?
100%. The whole idea of, I think sometimes DEI gets put in a separate bucket to high performance, and it shouldn't. It should be the fabric of the organization. And there's two things that need to occur there to make that to happen. Firstly, corporate world used to think, let's just make everyone exactly the same. And it starts at the interview process. You speak to people and say, wow, this person gets me, they talk the same way, this is going to work really well. They just happen to come from exactly the same place I do, with the same cultural beliefs and background. So the first thing is you need to create a corporate world where you don't have to be the best at everything. You've got to be able to be almost vulnerable as a leader to say, well, I'm not good at these things, and that's really important. Then the really tough bit is, well, how do I hire to my weaknesses? And that's what organizations who are really trying to get to that high performance through diversity struggle with. How do I hire people that are different to me, and not just based on the color of their skin or what country they're born in, but I need to find a high performing team that can fill those gaps.
And then provide an environment where they can actually succeed and thrive. Yeah. Lindell, I want to touch on, I mean, you're a big activist, and you're committed to removing barriers of marginalized students in particular. Can you tell me how the role that this has played in the world that the work that you do within astronomy?
Sure. So this is obviously a very complicated subject. So I'm just going to give a very simple one-dimensional approach here. There's a really quick statistic. In 2021, 577 PhDs were awarded to white students, white doctorates to white students. In the same year, 14 were awarded to Black students. So there's a huge range of difference between those two statistics. So that's just one kind of justice and equity data point. I don't really like that word, but let's just say that's a data point. We also know as an organization that we are collecting astronomical amounts of data, huge amount of data that we cannot currently process and analyze and deliver to astronomers across the world. That's just something that we know is a deficit. And that deficit is just going to grow over the next decades. So we have to look ahead, and we have to find a workforce. We have to find people who will fill that gap for us. We're very fortunate in that I think our director is very forward thinking. He's also very interested in equity. And so he said, you know what, why don't we look to where the expertise is already? And we know that historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, produce more Black physicists than any other university system in the country. So we have existing partnerships with HBCUs, and our director said, why don't we start working with the HBCUs and come up with a plan to train, educate, and prepare hundreds, thousands of people to work in this data field. And as everyone knows, data is the future, right? We really need people who know how to do this. So we really focus a lot on how are we going to manage the data that we are producing, and how do we do that in a way that increases equity within our workforce at the same time. So that's our focus.
I'm going to come back, and thank you for that, Lindell. I mean, it's what's bouncing around in my head at the moment, and where I feel there's alignment. Here in Australia, depending on which research paper you read, but we're currently a workforce. The technology workforce here is 861,000 people. There's a goal to get that to 1.2 million in the next few years if we're going to have the workforce of the future that's needed to fuel the industry. So we're in a similar situation in regards to how do we find those people, train them in a timely fashion and bring them in to our workforce in an equitable way. So, it's, clearly it's not an easy thing to do, but Warren, in your experience in regards to working with global diverse and building global diverse high performing teams, what are some of the nuggets that you feel you can share that help, that make that successful? Because it's not easy, right?
Yeah, it's not easy. I think what Lindell said there is the first nugget, and that is you need ownership at the top to be able to look for skills and expertise in places you've never looked before. Like 10 years ago, there were tech companies out there saying, well, if you haven't got a university degree, then don't apply. Well, that cuts out a lot of people that can't afford to go to university, but they might have those skills and those traits, or they might have the traits you want. You might be able to develop those skills internally. So that's sort of the first nugget is, I think if you're a DEI leader, it's thinking about how do we educate the organization internally to see the opportunity. There has been such a big focus on the social aspects, and that's really critical. I'm not taking away from that at all. But I don't think organizations actually understand the benefit of it from a performance, from an outcome standpoint. So how do DEI individuals educate the leadership to make that's open? I don't look at a resume now and say, well, what university did they go to? I want to find out where they were born, what schools they went to, how they grew up, what were their experiences that created that individual. And funnily enough, when I've got an interview I'm finding really tough, that's when I get most excited, because suddenly I've got someone who might be different to me. And so I think those are the what Lindell said is so critical. The ownership at the top, educating people to the outcomes is the next. And then developing an environment where you know how to build teams, not just people the same as you.
So there's a lot of conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion, and the competitive advantage it may give you, and the, how it leads to innovation and all this good stuff. If it's talked about and it's known, why isn't it a business priority? Why are we still having to have conversations like today, to really position the need for this as a priority? So I mean, Lindell, when you look at the world of academia, and you've touched on some of the barriers in regards to, depending on your ethnicity and where you are, you recognize that there is an understanding. Why is this not just common practice for all?
Yeah, so it's a really tricky. In the years that I've been doing this, I think I've come to understand that a lot of it is that people are trained in academia in a certain way, and in a certain way of looking at the world. The meritocracy is a really big deal, right? And there's a real focus on working hard and all of these kinds of things. And there's a certain blindness for many people to the reality of the inaccessibility of that to a large number of people. And so it's really not how hard you work yourself, right? It's what doors were open to you. And so really kind of making that understanding and awareness part of our culture has, I think, made the most difference. It's like your experience is unique to you, right? And there's a whole world out there of people who have different experiences. And some of the thought that goes into it, for example, the idea that you must have a PhD in order to process data. And that's simply not true. We experimented and we learned, no, you don't. And so we had to really look at the assumptions that we make in academia that can keep people out, arguably unattendedly, right? Sometimes that's the case. And that's what we can work with, right? We can work with, well, you don't really want to keep people out. So what do we do? What are we doing that does that? So we spend a lot of effort unpacking the unseen barriers that we put in place.
Yeah, and I think we see that a lot, in business as well. I mean, I guess the transition that needs to happen in regards to, it's one thing as an organization or as an industry, recognizing we need to be better, we need to do different, but it's challenging for if you're the first person of difference coming into the organization, how can we create the environment to make sure that they feel safe? And they're not represented. So it's one of the, I don't know, Warren, if you've had any experience around that in regards to, as you can't change it overnight. There's a process that needs to happen. What are some of the methodologies and needs to, to ensure that that process is in place and it serves the best needs of the individual?
Yeah, I think I'll use an example, Lee. I do a lot of work in sports world and organizations across the globe. And I used to go in and do this thing where I would be coaching leaders, and I get them to assess themselves. And I remember doing an assessment of this group where they rate themselves on their skills. And one of the things that you'll learn, I was speaking to Harriet Brown, who runs sessions on elite female athletes, and she has the same problem with these female athletes. And what we'll notice is that men tend to rate themselves higher in skills than females. And to be honest, the men that rate them lower.
Why does that not surprise me, Warren?
But there's an important lesson here, because then we also learned that the men that rated themselves below the women were actually lying. But that's a whole different story. They actually thought they were pretty good. But anyway, what that taught me was that we tend in organizations to ask people to apply for leadership roles. Okay. And we found that women weren't applying because they tend to go, yeah, I'm not ready. Whereas males tend to go, yeah, I'm always ready. I'm ready to be the CEO, right? It's just in the nature. So in terms of making that safe, what I did in those organizations is change that around. And it goes to Lindell's point, which is we, instead of asking people to apply, we made it our job to go and find them. So that was really, really important. We changed that around. So from an organizational standpoint, if you're actively going, and I'm just using the male-female analogy now, if we went to the females and said, no, you have all of these aspects that we want, we believe you can be a great leader, so we're bringing you into these development programs, that is the first step in making people feel safe, is that it's not waiting for people to step up so that, females are tended to be seen as aggressive or too competitive if they want to, move ahead. So change it around. And I think it just keeps coming back to the same nuggets that Lindell started with. She has a leader that she's worked with that's changed the dynamics in the organization. Now, imagine if we could go into different parts. That's just male, female. Imagine if we could go into communities to look for tech people that are in our Aboriginal communities. Imagine if we could do that in schools in poor areas. We should not be limiting ourselves in terms of high performance on whether people can afford it or not. I think it's one of the things I hate the most. And that means organizations have to become smart. They've got to go and look for these things. So I think that's how you make it safe. You turn it into the organization looking and bringing those people in.
And I think on that point as well, Warren, using inclusive language, right? I think, the technology industry, we're guilty, and you work for Gartner, so you know that more better than most. We're often guilty of using non-inclusive language, so we isolate people by our acronyms and our terms that we assume everybody knows and they don't. Lindell, I want to, when we called up the other week, in regards to this, creating a safe pathway and haven for minority groups to come into an organization. Can you share with me the example with the university and the colleges that you worked with? I think that's really interesting and important for everyone to hear.
Okay, sure. So we've been working for about 10 years to support marginalized students from HBCUs to experience summer research at majority white institutions, so that when they apply to graduate school, they have that research experience that is necessary to get into graduate school. And the students have been very successful in getting in. We hear from students that they struggle still, being the only Black student, for example, in majority white spaces. They're not necessarily safe. And so these organizations that we work with need to do some work. And to their credit, many of them know that. But there are a lot of barriers that crop up for marginalized students that are hidden to many of the organizations that they're coming into. So for example, graduate students are often in physics and astronomy are often given a very generous annual stipend. Their tuition is paid for, they get a nice package on offer, and yet they are often expected to travel across country, move to a new city, set up residence in a new city, pay all these deposits, all of these kinds of things. And when one of our first graduate students was accepted, they realized they couldn't do this. They didn't have the funds. Their family didn't have the funds to get them across country and pay deposits. And when we talked to the university, the first response was, well, they can put it on their credit card and pay it back, right? And so that was just a real blind spot that, you know, we kind of, it's funny to laugh about, and it's also so tragic because it's a really simple structural institutional thing that nobody recognized, right? And so what we spend a lot of time doing is listening to the students, listening to the experiences that they have, taking it very seriously and exploring the structural barriers that exist for the students, and then systematically try to dismantle those barriers. And so that's some work that NRAO has taken on. We're doing it internally, but we're also trying to reach out and be a model for our partner organizations on how to be aware of the environment in which we're bringing students.
That's fantastic, Lynelle. Thanks for sharing that. Now I'm going to go to one of the questions that's just popped up here from Amy, because I think it's a good segue. So it's a question for you, Warren. Now, oh goodness me, can you see the question, Warren? Because my eyesight is shocking. So, I need to put my hand up to Zoom. I don't know if we can make the fonts better, bigger on the Q&A part, but I'm not feeling very included at the moment. So I think it says, if traits from diverse people leads to a stronger team, once necessary skills have been developed, how does a small organization look to diversify the team when there are very limited resources to developing new skills?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And so I work with both very large organizations and very small organizations as well. And I think the most important thing that I've done that's made it easy for me is I don't try and pretend that I'm going to be diverse across every single realm that's possible. I pick the big buckets, and so that's what I would suggest in terms of the question for small organizations: is pick somewhere to start. Is that just simply male and female? Is that the place you can start? And then as the organization builds out, then start to think about, all right, are there different ways that we can start picking some bigger buckets? I think probably the biggest struggle I've seen, especially with smaller organizations, as I said, I'm right in the middle of a very, very small organization looking at this, and Luli took me to task on it. You know, she was looking at our website and she went, you know, there's just a bunch of guys on the website. And we're saying, yeah, we're trying to do this, but I would suggest pick the big buckets and solve them as you go throughout the organization. So I hope that answers the question.
And I think just to add to that, Warren, because, you know, one of my concerns around the conversation that's happening at the moment around diversity is that it is very limited. We talk, a lot is around gender, but I think if we can celebrate the diversity that already exists within an organization, like, what would have been a great response when I held you to task around the team at Brood. I'm just going by what I can see on the website. For all I know, there could be neurodivergence in there could be disability, there are cultural differences. So I think, we need to change the conversation. And the conversation needs to be more about being representative of the society that we serve. Because it's by making it a gender conversation, then if you're the male gender, you feel excluded and can't be part of it. But I think if we can celebrate and understand and learn the diversity that exists within the organization, then it leads to a far more, I think, positive outcome and a positive dialogue and a positive journey. So it's a lot of what we talk about at the foundation around being representative of society, but using platforms like Diversity Atlas to understand who you are as an organization first, celebrate that, identify where the gaps are, and then be intentional about programs that you run to want to change that and be able to measure the impact of that change. There was one thing I've learned from my Gartner days, if we can't measure this thing called DE&I and the business impact of it, then it's not going to be, we're never going to get universal priority and strategy around it. So that's my soapbox over. But I just think let's change the conversation and around diversity and what it represents.
Yeah. So Lee, I think we are obsessed with measuring, and I think that's a really good point. I do think organizations try to take on too much too soon, and just my view in all of this is transform 1% at a time. Just find your big buckets and then move on. But I also don't think you should try and measure it. I think you can feel it, you can see it, and so and it's inside that organization. And then there are things we can measure in terms of the amount of people working, but does that measure how safe? We've got to do surveys and all of those sorts of things. Ultimately, it needs to be ingrained in your culture, and people have to be able to talk to each other and go, you know what, this is kind of cool to be here.
So to that point, and Lindell, you may have found some of this, right? It's so there's an encouraging statistic, and I think it's on LinkedIn in regards to there's been a 71% increase in diversity manager type hires in the last 5 years, which in some respects that gets a thumbs up. But the caveat to that is the responsibility then becomes it sits on their shoulders. So it's kind of like you're the diversity manager. Fix it, and fix the culture, fix the diversity within the organization. So how do you navigate through that? Because what we're now seeing, which is concerning, is that people in these particular roles are only staying 2 to 3 years because they're not supported. It's too much of a challenge. So how, I don't know from your experience, Lindell, if you've come across that and how you've managed to navigate it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I am actually very proud of the work that we've done, and I say we, meaning the entire organization. The leadership team has learned a lot about the importance of DE&I work, and they have embraced it. I would say it's just incredible. DE&I, all of our initiatives are on the agenda for our weekly executive meetings. It's reported on. All managers have an obligation to keep this DE&I lens in their hiring, in the way in which they work with their employees. It's really deeply embedded now, and it took a while for that to happen. But I don't think that it's on my shoulders, right? I don't feel like it's on my shoulders or on the team that we have together in our office. I really think that it's spread around the organization, and that's the way it needs to be, right? It needs to be completely spread around so that when I leave or when members of my team leave, it doesn't collapse, right? I'm looking at retirement in the next 6 months. I'm really not worried about what will happen when I leave, right? Because there are champions embedded at all levels.
Was that an expose, by the way, there, Lindell, that you're looking to retire in 6 months? You just thought you could slip that one in and no one pick it up. Oh, dear. Yeah, but how about you? I mean, it's not your responsibility, but you're obviously a leader that lives and breathes by the importance of being diverse and inclusive.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to what Lindell said, and I'm going to quote some Gartner research here, is long gone are the organizations that transform from the leadership down. I like to say innovation is driven from the ground up, not from the top down. And the most successful organizations have what they call open source transformation, where the leadership, first of all, has to build that, where people across the company can contribute. They contribute to what change they want. They contribute to how that's going to happen. And so that's how you fundamentally change the culture, so that someone doesn't leave and then, we're back to it being a process or a metric. Open source transformation is about the organization coming together and making sure it transforms at the right speed in the way that they want it to change. And I fundamentally believe that's how organizations transfer quicker and for the long term. And there's another cool thing that happens then, is that you find a lot of people with similar values come together to work inside those organizations. It really impacts the attrition in those businesses. So still, I keep bringing it back to the fact that the outcomes are just superior. They're incredible. And we talk about high performance as if it's a bad thing. It's an awesome thing. You're thinking about the fun you have inside, that you have these lifelong relationships, you're making true change. And when Lindell resigns, it'd be so disappointing if all of those things fell apart, because then it wouldn't be about the business doing that transformation.
I love that open source transformation, and it's not a buzzword or phrase, Warren. It's a movement.
It's a move. I don't know. It's in our.
It's a magic quadrant on it. That's my question.
Well, there's a lot of Gartner research on it. It's fabulous, looking at organizations that do that. But that's what we've termed it, is open source transformation. Give it to the people to help with that transformation.
Absolutely.
I love that. Oh, I thought it was a question, but it's Jennifer Todd just telling us that she's got to go. And thank you for a great session, and she looks forward to speaking with us all soon. Thank you, Jennifer. Now, listen, I'm conscious of time, and I do want everyone to get back to the day. One more nugget or one more gem. I mean, I think it's as I said, it's quite a mix of people on the webinar today from all different parts of the business. Some are in that HR role, some are the DI practitioners, some are managers. I mean, I think the open source transformation is a great nugget, Warren, for people to think about and to take away and look at how they apply. But being realistic, this isn't a quick fix. This isn't going to change overnight. So it's challenging times right now. How do you get the organization to, if they're not already committed to this and recognize the value and the importance of it, how do you get them to commit now to a long tail transformation?
So from my perspective, one of the things that's really important with DEI leaders is making sure there's the how do I do that? And why do I do that? Right now, there's all this uncertainty across the global economies. People are going, what's going to happen? So the business results are really, really important. So how does DEI contribute not just to the social aspects, but to the business? How can you actually help? How can you talked about this resilience? I want a whole group of people in the room with me if we face any struggles in any business I'm working with, who can give me different ways of thinking about solving a problem. And so that's really, really important. A lot of leaders don't know how to do that. So taking that role as the DEI leader and saying, how do I educate the business to deliver to the outcomes? How do I educate the business to do that is just so critical. Don't just run programs. Think about, how can I actually help the business perform or be resilient in these times?
And I guess, Lindell, without stealing, passing, final comment from yourself, I guess from a, in regards to the world of academia, similar, right? In regards to the need for the organization to diversify, to fill the roles and the gaps when you talk about the data scientist side of things. So, is that a similar piece of advice that you'll give to people in regards to aligning this to the business priorities and needs at the time?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, all of us, academia, research, we all produce something, right? We all have a goal in mind. I don't know that it's as easy to make a business case when it comes to profitability or income. It's a little more difficult to do. So I think that we do tend to lean a little bit more on the equity and social justice, and this is the right thing to do. I think that is a more pervasive argument within academia and research. But it also still takes education. It takes an ability to for leadership to see the barriers that they have, hopefully inadvertently, sometimes it's consciously, but often I think it's inadvertently put in place to keep the status quo, to keep the same people doing the same things, right? And so we do lean heavily on, well, what would it look like if we did it differently, right? What if we had different thoughts? And at the same time, it's fair to bring in other people, right? So, that's, I think, a big focus for us, is leaning on the fairness and the equity, and on the benefits to research, the benefits to education in having multiple experiences and viewpoints represented when we're trying to solve problems.
Perfect. Couldn't put it better myself. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you both. I mean, I've really enjoyed the discussion today, and like Jennifer said, you know, I could talk to you all day. So please, everybody, you know, the education bit that, you know, both Warren and Lindell have touched on is strongly in line with the Tech Diversity Academy. The reason why we started the DEI Discovery course is to support the practitioners and HR managers in providing those tools and the understanding to be able to position the importance of this within the business. So if you haven't, please jump online, go to the Tech Diversity website, download the course prospectus, and hopefully we'll see you on the 2nd of March and we can go on this together. But Warren, Lindell, thank you both. And I hope to have the opportunity to talk to you again in the future.
Same here. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindell.
Okay. Bye, Warren.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.